have a Bible and you find it helpful to follow along, please turn it to Mark chapter 7, the 7th chapter of Mark's Gospel. That's where we'll spend our time. There are a lot of texts in the Bible that I just would say are hard. As a matter of fact, on my shelves at home, I've got several books, really big ones, that are dedicated to nothing but the hard sayings that you find in the Bible. And I'm glad they're there. We read our Bible a lot of times, I think, errantly when we read a text like the one we're going to look at today without considering why it's hard. We just sort of read through it and carry on. Now, part of that is if you're a born-again believer, the Spirit of God lives in you, and so there's a certain sense in which we can accept things in the Bible that an unbeliever cannot accept. They're just not able, and they focus on the elements that are hard and make that the whole of the text. Well, that's wrong just as well. What is it about this text we're going to look at today that would build up? That's the question I want to ask us here. Is there something here that would build up? I think there is, but it's going to take a little work to get to it. Let's look at the text. It's Mark chapter 7, verse 24 is where I'll begin the reading. And let me just make a point here. It says after Jesus left there, what he's talking about is where he is. He is in the northern parts of Judea above Lake Gennesaret, above Lake Galilee. He's in the area that is known as the Samaria of the Gentiles, because there's a lot of Gentiles that live in this area, and he's gone north now. So let's read the text. After Jesus left there, he went to the region of Tyre, and when he went into a house, he didn't want anyone to know he was there, but he was not able to escape notice. Instead, a woman whose young daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about Jesus and came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Greek, Syrophoenician in origin. She asked Jesus to cast the demon out of her daughter. Jesus said to her, "Let the children be satisfied first. It's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." The woman answered, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." And Jesus said to her, "Because you've said this, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." She went home and found the child lying in bed, and the demon was gone. Now, I don't care what anybody says, this is a hard saying. Is Jesus just showing Jewish prejudice here? Here's the maker of the universe referring to a member of the Goyim, that is the nations outside of Judaism, as the dogs. It just seems like it fits what I would say or is the Jewish understanding at its worst. That's the way it looks. If you don't know anything about what's going on here, that's exactly how this looks. This is a Gentile woman. They're in a Gentile dominant territory of Judea, and he's actually out of Judea now. He's in Syria. Hence the Syrophoenician woman. She's a Phoenician living in Syria. It's Gentile territory, and one would expect Jesus to run into the Gentiles. I got into a conversation with somebody online, and they said, Jesus never spoke to Gentiles. I said, well, you need to go back and check that. He spoke to a bunch of them. Matthew chapter 15, he speaks to, well, this text is actually parallel to Matthew 15. There are other passages where Jesus speaks to a centurion, a Roman Gentile, whose servant is at home and who is sick, and Jesus heals. Tyre and Sidon, where Jesus is, figure greatly in the New Testament and the Old. They figure greatly in the biblical record in Jewish history. Tyre was conquered by Alexander the Great. I don't know if you're aware of that. The prophecy relative to Tyre is given to us in Ezekiel 28, and it is in exacting detail relative to the history 200 years later of how Alexander conquered that fortress island. I mean, exactly what the Bible says was going to happen is what Alexander did. It's amazing. I would encourage anybody to read Ezekiel 28 to see what happened to Tyre, and then get a good historical textbook of some kind or an encyclopedia and read about Tyre and Alexander the Great, and you will see that exactly what God said was going to happen is exactly what happened. It's amazing. But this area was Phoenician in its history. And what's fascinating about that is it was actually supposed to be part of Israel. The tribe of Asher was given this territory, but the Jews never really took it. And so it wound up being continually part of Syria at this point in history. The Phoenicians were the first group of people that we know of historically who traveled the oceans by navigating by stars, locations. We don't know of anybody prior. There could have been. We don't know of anybody. The Phoenicians traveled all over the world via their navigational abilities. They are also the first, that we think, one of the very first actual alphabets that exist in the world. The Phoenicians were a pretty significant group of people. They were great seafarers. And so Tyre and Sidon, that two-city grouping, Tyre being the island offshore, became a huge port. So this is a very significant location. But then we come to this woman. And by the way, if you want to check out how Tyre and Sidon, that region, figure into Jewish history, just go to Joshua 19 and see where Joshua divides up the lands, and you'll see. Get a good map and you'll be able to see how that figures. But this Gentile woman, very much like the centurion in Matthew 8, who's a Gentile, comes to Jesus for a healing for somebody who's not there. Remember the centurion, my servant's at home, and Jesus heals the centurion at a distance. This woman is the same. And in both these cases, these are the cases where Jesus, if you go to Matthew chapter 15, where the parallel for this passage in Mark is, you see Jesus in recognition of her great faith. He said the same thing to the centurion. I've not found such great faith in all of Israel. He didn't say that about a lot of the Jews he healed. The woman in this exchange, what I find fascinating is she does not become defensive about this conversation at all. Can you imagine if you were that woman and you'd gone up to Jesus for healing and he'd said to you, you know, it's not right to give the food to the dogs. I mean, what would that say to you or me? If I came to Jesus and I said, Jesus, my son is at home, he's really sick, would you heal him? And he looks at me, knowing that I'm a Gentile, and says, it's not right to give the food to the dogs. Gosh. But this woman doesn't become defensive. She just accepts her place. Now, what's going on here? This language so stark in English is not stark if you are a Greek-speaking person at this time in history. And I'm going to say, people argue about the language that Jesus actually spoke. Most scholarship says he probably spoke amongst the disciples Aramaic, which was the common language in Judea. But he had to be at least bilingual, had to speak Greek. He refers to the Septuagint throughout his ministry, and he had a business. Jesus' dad and he ran a business. And you look at some of the things wherein various cities are referred to in the Gospels, you know that Joseph and Jesus sold farm implements that they had made to cities like Sychar. Greek was the lingua franca. You couldn't do business in the Roman Empire if you didn't speak Greek. You had to speak Greek. So I'm sure Jesus was speaking Greek to this woman. She's a Greek. And there's a very specific language element here that if you don't know it, this text looks really troublesome. It looks like Jesus is being very prejudicial toward this woman. But if you know the language, it's not that case at all. There is a mood. Greek has moods. We have moods. But Greek has specific grammatical moods. One of them is called the diminutive mood. And it is how this word is used in this text when he says dogs. Now, we do this all the time. Let me explain how. We have a word. I could have picked any, but this is the one that came to my mind. We have the word rascal. Rascal. We use it all the time. It can be used negatively. We could say something like, that rascal will steal anything that's not nailed down. Or how do you know if that rascal's lying? His lips are moving. We say that sort of thing. That's a negative way. However, we say it in a positive way. We say, that rascal's as smart as a whip. Or we say, that rascal caught that ball and scored a touchdown. That was amazing. So we're using it in both ways. Now, the people at this time, in this point of history where Jesus is having this conversation, they understand their culture very, very well. Very well. This woman's a Gentile. She knows that. You remember Jesus with the woman at the well? A Gentile. A Samaritan, worse yet. And she and Jews were not even supposed to talk to each other. But Jesus has that conversation. Why? There's a cultural element there. It's the same with this woman. She is a Gentile. She's looking back at a history that is 700 years old. 700 years! And the memory of that 700-year history is still right there for this woman. She understands her place. She knows Jesus is a Jewish rabbi. And I'm not even supposed to speak with a Jewish rabbi, much less as a woman, worse yet, as a Gentile. And yet, there they are having this conversation. So what's going on? You know, one of the problems we face in our national efforts, we've spent 20 years in Afghanistan. They're still wearing turbans. They still believe the Quran. They're still hooked into Sharia. Why is that? They have a culture. They have a culture. And it's a very, very, very old culture. And we're not just going to go over there with the Constitution and Bill of Rights and convince them that that's the way they ought to be. This part of the world culture is very, very deep. And here, this is only 700 years removed from the time in which Assyria had conquered the northern part of Israel and deported a bunch of people, and a bunch of people had moved back in from Assyria and they had intermarried. This is 700 years is nothing in a history like this. Jesus and this woman are having a conversation that you and I might have commonly. Now, I don't know this about women. There are a lot of things about women I do not understand. I've never been one, I don't think. And so there are things about women I don't understand, but I do understand fairly well being a man. Men can talk to one another in ways that I've never heard women talk to each other this way. Now, maybe you do. I would have to have a report about that because I've never experienced it. But a man will walk up to another man. This is so common. Friends. And they'll say, you know, it's a good thing you shaved this morning. And the guy will say, why is that? Well, it gave you a chance to scrape off some of the ugly. And we laugh. We just think that's funny. I don't know if you remember, there was a show on the History Channel. Does everybody here know who Arlie Ermy is? He used to be a drill sergeant. And he had a show about military hardware on the History Channel. And the show started out the same way every time. His face would fill the screen, and he's wearing that Frisbee hat that a drill sergeant wears in the Marines. And he's pointing his finger right at me, and he's saying, listen, maggot. And I'm thinking, I liked being called a maggot. I felt like we were friends almost in that. Jesus and this woman are having just that kind of conversation here. That is exactly what's going on, and it's based upon the Greek, the diminutive mood of the word dog. Jesus probably was grinning when this conversation took place. And the woman was grinning too. It's like they're having a backslapping conversation about a cultural aspect of who they are and where they live and the times in which they live, that they fully together understood one another here. It was a kind of an edgy joke between them. A dog in a Greek culture was understood to be, an audacious woman would be referred to as a dog in the Greek culture. A woman who's just loud and boisterous and audacious. You know, what we would call today is when I lived in the New Jersey area, hairspray and earrings. I remember somebody telling me once, this woman, we weren't dating at the time. I was unmarried. And this woman came up to me after a concert and seemed like she was interested in me. And the drummer came to me later and said, you know, that girl, I think she liked you, Rip. I said, yeah, maybe so. I mean, I'm too stupid for this. I never picked up on this as I grew up. But he said, you know, but she doesn't look like somebody you'd date. That was all hairspray and earrings. And I thought, well, okay, I guess I understand what you mean. But that would be a dog to a Greek. They would refer to a woman that way. A dog for a Jew, that was a word of contempt. You were saying something contemptuous about someone. But there was a way in which the word was used in Greek that's called the diminutive. And it was always a term of affection. A dog would be a family pet. How do I know that? Well, all you've got to do is look at the text. This woman was not shocked by this conversation at all. She stayed right there with Jesus and gave it back as good as she got. Yeah, but the dogs eat the crumbs, don't they? I mean, she's with him in this whole thing. We understand the wording a little better, but what does it say to us today? Well, I think, again, there's a little bit of history here we have to understand before it really hits us what's going on. Obviously, the woman has great faith. We could pick that from it and just close and go home. We need to have more faith. Yay. But the woman was content to be a dog and only get the crumbs. What does she mean by that? Again, it's an historical picture. When the Middle Easterners ate meals, they didn't have forks, knives, or even chopsticks. None. No utensils. They had these. You had gravies. A typical Middle Eastern meal in that culture would be some gravies, some vegetables, and bread. And they would take the bread and they would tear a piece off with their hands and stick it in the gravy with their hands and eat the bread with their hands, eat the vegetables with their hands, eat the rice with their hands, whatever they had, the barley, and they'd get it all over their fingers. You'd take a handful of barley and dip it in the gravy and then eat it. Well, guess what? All that's on your fingers. What do? You couldn't have napkins. A piece of cloth this big, you didn't own stuff like that if you were a common person in that realm. Can you imagine? I want you to take a look when you get home at a handkerchief. Pull it out of your pocket and look at it. And imagine having to stitch that by hand. A handkerchief would be 6 months' wages in that culture. People spent a whole year's wages on a tunic because it had to be hand stitched. You're not just making the fabric shape, you're actually making the fabric with your hands. Can you imagine? So they would take bits of bread, they would keep one bit of bread aside, and they would take that bit of bread and wipe the gravy off their hands. That was the napkin. And when they were done eating, they would toss it to the family pet. This is exactly what Jesus is describing here. This woman knows it. That's why she's not offended at all. She goes right on with it. And notice her here. She is completely vulnerable. She's completely expressing need. She has no defensiveness whatsoever. Her attitude toward Jesus is, call me whatever you want, but call me. That's her attitude. However Jesus will accept her, she will come and be glad about it. Most people in our culture who don't believe will not come that way. They're not willing to come the way of, I'll come any way you want, Lord, just accept me. No. They want to hang on to their dignity, whatever that is. You've got to come to me my way, God. That's the attitude. Show me something. Make the table float. Heal my sore on my arm. Give me a good job. Give me whatever, and then I'll believe in you. And God says, forget it. Forget it. You have to come to me. I'm not coming to you. I'm not going to change. I've already come to you. Look what I've done. I've hung on a cross. He's already come to us in a way that says, I'm willing to come underneath you. Now, what are you going to do with that? And this woman is exactly there. She's saying, look, I just want you to accept me. Do this for me, Jesus. I'm coming to you. If I'm a dog, I'm a dog. I'm willing to be a dog if you'll heal my daughter. Man. You know, I've got a book at home. It's a book of hymnody. You may not know what hymnody is. It's the history of hymns. And all it is, it's not a book of hymns. It's a book about the history of each of these hymns that are written up in this book. And in every one of those hymns, I can't think of one that's not this way. The hymns are written from a place of pain. A place of pain, always. It seems to me that pain is probably one of the best teachers we have, because it brings out parts of us that would never be brought out had we not gone through the pain. This woman is a case in point. She's still teaching us today. She came to Jesus in deep pain for her daughter. And it teaches me something else here that is so much a part of life for me. She asks God with no inhibition whatsoever. She wants something, she's going to ask God for that thing. Lord, heal my daughter. She doesn't take any thought for whether or not maybe God doesn't want my daughter healed. No, she doesn't consider that. She just asks for the healing. I was reading, and I read a lot of stuff as I prepare for sermons that never make it here. As a matter of fact, 25% of what I put on my outline never makes it here either. But nevertheless, this one's going to make it here because I thought it was significant. It's a story about a hiker that I saw who was on a hike and in the mountains alone, and got tired and sat down on a rock above the tree line. Everything pretty much is a rock. And sat down, and you know how, have you ever been outside and you're doing stuff, and then you sit down, you get closer to the ground, you start to notice stuff that you never would take notice of before, like a bug crawling on a piece of grass or whatever. So this guy sits down, and there's a line of ants coming across the rock, and one of the ants has strayed from the line, is carrying a pine needle, portion of a pine needle, which for an ant is like you or me going out and lifting Ed's car on our shoulder and walking away with it. I mean, that's ant compared to that pine needle. It's several times the size of the ant. It's got it in its jaws, and it's dragging the thing along, and it comes to a crack in the rock and sticks its feelers out. It's feeling, trying to get, how am I going to get around the crack? Lets go of the pine needle, walks around in several circles. You know how ants do. It looks like they don't know what they're doing. And can't get the pine needle across the crack. And then all of a sudden it grabs the pine needle midway and shoves it forward, and suddenly the pine needle stops because it hits the other side of the crack, and the ant gets up on the pine needle and goes across the crack and picks the pine needle back up and merrily goes on its way. That was a burden for that ant. That burden became a bridge for something better for the ant. This woman's burden was her daughter, and her daughter became a bridge between her and Jesus. I think many times the burdens in our lives become the bridge between us and God that would never be if we didn't have those burdens to bear. It's the bridge between us and God doing something really great in our lives. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything